Anthony Almojera and I met virtually. We've never been in the same room, not yet.
Not yet.
Met virtually right in the throes of 2020 in a theater of war production first.
I believe so. Yes, that's where we got connected through.
No, Jeffrey Wright actually connected us via email, and we wrote through the pandemic together with a group of healthcare workers who were brave and brilliant. And when Anthony's in the room, everything drops. Like everyone just sort of can drop into themselves because he drops into himself. He's an extraordinary, extraordinary human being, a writer, a philosopher, I would say, an activist, and one of the most passionate and generous and driven people that I know. I'm really, really grateful to be in community with him, and excited to have him here. Rob will put his official bio into the chat. Anthony's a big deal in all these ways, but if you're here, you know that. And I wanted to get started with just talking to Anthony a little bit. So let's welcome Anthony. Where are you here from, Anthony? Are you at home?
I'm at home at the moment in Brooklyn, New York. It's about 90 degrees with humidity, and my air conditioner broke. So I love the fact that I'm speaking to you with the heat on, all loose and ready to go.
Excellent, excellent. How has this journey been for you? So the book has just come out. This extraordinary, extraordinary work.
It's been amazing. You know, Seema and Diana were there while I was going through the process, and being in those workshops helped me unlock parts of the brain to get creative, to think about writing in different ways, especially with poetry, using other words to describe feelings and emotions. The response to the book has been overwhelming in many ways. There's so many people that have reached out to me with these wonderful messages. And it's all different parts of the book. You know, some people with the childhood stuff I talk about, hey, I went through that. It's nice to know I'm not alone, which is the number one thing in this group with community building artworks and community. Like Seema said, we're all a little weird, and we connect and we realize we're not really that weird. We have these shared experiences. Our weirdness is not the unique thing. I think the response to the weirdness is what gives us our flavor and uniqueness, right? We all have these things we grow up in. So those things have been wonderful. Of course, from the medical and EMS community that I represent, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. You're telling our story, Anthony. Somebody had to tell it, and that was important to me because I represent those members and EMS and other, of course, the medical community at large, that I wanted to timestamp something that we went through, which was important in this memoir, that I didn't want people to forget.
Which sort of brings me to my next question, which is, you know, you write about it in the book, and I think many of us know this about you, is that you were first sort of motivated to tell your story on a larger scale to change something in a broken system, to try to bring light, to try to bring sort of awareness to this, you know, the fact that EMS is the backbone of the healthcare system in the United States, period. And then further during COVID, that got ratcheted up. And so you write a scene in the book about approaching a bank of camera people and going down the line and deciding to tell your story. And you told this broader story. And in the book, you're doing both of those things. And can you talk about like how you, because there's something like almost more comfortable about speaking for other people, right? But then you decide like, hey, I'm going to show up as myself on the page. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So when I went in front of those camera banks, the motivation was nobody was telling the story of what EMS was seeing during the pandemic, which historically nobody tells EMS the story to begin with. So the medics and EMTs were going into people's homes and they would be doing CPR on people with this strange virus and they couldn't get them back. But meanwhile, the pressure is ratcheted up. When I come into your house, I see the photos of Johnny on the wall and the memories of Christmas and a life that's lived. And I have to tell people, normally I can tell people what happened and when, and take comfort that we tried. With this, we couldn't do that. We couldn't even comfort them physically with our arm around them or a handshake. So I would see Governor Cuomo talk about 1,000 people died, and no, the number was actually 1,400 because 400 people died before they got to the hospital in EMS. So I went in front of those cameras to tell the story, and you're right, it's easy to represent others because you feel righteous in your representation.
Right.
So when you speak for others, not only publicly or privately, I'm the vice president of the union I represent. So it's easy for me to speak about the trials and tribulations that we go through, to raise awareness, to make sure that we're taken care of in certain ways. And you feel righteous in that. It's a justified cause. When you speak about yourself, it's not always righteous. As a matter of fact, a lot of times it's shameful. There's a lot of shame you have to build around and break through, because you're going to expose yourself, especially in a memoir. And sometimes it's through heavy prose and just really getting into the meat of A, B, C, and you get didactic in that process of breaking through so that you can not feel so much the shame anymore in writing it. And it's therapeutic. It releases some of that.
Yeah.
Therapy and other things will help release the others, but
of course.
Yeah. So when the hardest thing is, it's easy to want to write about yourself in a righteous way to make yourself feel heroic, especially when you talk about all the things you went through in life, and you want to do that. You want to put a nice little bow on it, but no, you can't do that.
No. And you really managed not to, which I think is extraordinary, because you wrote this, fairly quickly as far as writing books goes. And you did some deep work here. And I was really interested in how the structure of this book sort of takes place over the course of a year. And of course, you're a practicing Buddhist, and so your relationship to time is maybe a little bit more honed in the sense of like trying to stay present and being aware of all of the timelines that kind of overlap that create a moment. And you captured that in the book, right? So it's over the course of a year, but then you're also like, of course, you're living your past lives, and you're living your own past as new things are happening to you. When did that structure sort of arrive to you as a way to tell this story? And how did you keep moving forward without because there's a lot in the past, right? The past is longer than the 1 year. Can you, any part of that seems answerable?
Well, so I had the idea for a book, I want to say about 10 years ago, when I started working with all these people in EMS. It's easy. You sit in an ambulance. An ambulance is a confessional booth for people who haven't been in there. It's 2 feet by 2 feet. You can smell everything your partner's doing. You can almost taste it. You can see it. If they forgot to shave that morning, you can see the stubble. You can see everything. So there comes a point when you sit next to people, you can only talk about the Yankees and the weather so much. And then you start to at least for me, I became inquisitive, which some of that is natural and some of that is experiences you pick up along the way. And you start talking to them and where are you from? You start with the basics. And then all of a sudden, you have brothers and sisters. And I'll hang on that for a minute, because in the book, I talk about how so many people had brothers that passed away like I did. And you're like, wait a minute, that's not an anomaly. That's a definitive moment in someone's life where they could have went one way or the other, and somehow that path led them to be sitting next to me on an ambulance. And there's so many of us that have that marker amongst many. So I would literally say next to my sit next to my partners, and I would ask them, you know, and I pardon my French, but I would say, well, what's your shit? What do you got? Because spot it, you got it. Once I started to spot myself and others, then it made it easier for me to draw out the stories. And I would start writing them down. You know, I would start putting them down I carried a little book. Now, my partner, Mike, had a brother that died, and I had a brother that died, and he came to the EMS this way. It's not a natural job where, and like I'm sure so many people in this room, we all decided to do certain things that you see unnatural things, but it becomes natural for you. And the reason why it is a lot of us are preconditioned to that trauma. And we come in and we see a body over there and a head over there and everybody's screaming. And Seema and I are both the medic. And I go, well, what are we having for lunch? But what would happen is if you put me in a room quiet, I would be bouncing off the walls. So I had to start writing that down. And so all these stories of these similarities, I said, hey, there's something there. There's a story where I can write something where, hey, it's not an accident you get an EMS, but the problem is the arc, right? One of the biggest things about a memoir is you have to have an arc. I'm 45 years old, and in my head, each year of my life is important. But nobody wants to read how when I was 32, I went to the store and got milk and cookies, and that day was a little trying for me because the air conditioning. Nobody wants to read some of the minutia. So you have to have this arc. And what happened during the pandemic, and it sparked something where I can fit those stories in and out of this overarching arc of what's going on in society and how it mirrored all that stuff in my life. I'm breaking down, society's breaking down. And that can't be an accident that I'm feeling it the way I'm feeling it. I'm not detached from it because it's starting to mirror all the things, all the stories I collected. So you have this arc, you start to go with the stories and you start to try and blend them. And that's hard. You know, people who can paint probably have a little part of their brain where they can start to shade. You know, there's a part in the story where I talked about corrupted love. My mother hiding the drugs from my brother because she's worried about him. And she made me see that. She showed me a version of love, but it's corrupted. Right. And then I go into the end, and towards the end of the book where people are showing me a version of love, but I'm corrupted. I'm corrupted. So, you know, you start to weave these stories in and out. And one of the biggest things, and this is a little technical thing that helped me when the first draft of the book, it was a little wobbly. I changed the chapters from chapter 1, chapter 2 to months. And then now we were able to keep a pace. Pace is important. Pace is important when you're writing about your life. You know, your life has a lot of stakes and sometimes they raise and you want to keep pace in a memoir. Otherwise you get a presidential memoir. Where, you know, it's this big and you're reading all the, you know, I woke up on August 17th and I had the idea to pass this bill and, you know, but for a personal memoir, you want to have a little pace to it. And of course the ambulance is going by right on cue, you know, I paid them to do that. The pace of it really starts to help you in your writing. Because you're like, wait, no, this, when you reread it, you say, oh, this is messing up this pace. I'm no longer page turning, I'm stuck here. And that was important in a medical memoir. You can really get bogged down with medical terminology. And so when you read mine, I explain it quick so that the lay person understands what they're looking at and then keep going. Let's keep going, you know.
And you trust the reader also to be able to keep up, right? You explain it
Yes.
once and you're like, all right, I believe that you have this and that comes through on the page.
I trust that they have Google for whatever they can understand.
That's right. That's such an important thing as a poet, as a writer, to trust. I'm thinking too, as you're talking about the technical and the medical part of it, about privacy and HIPAA and telling the stories of individuals, which is necessary, right? You have to tell individual stories. If this was abstracted completely, we wouldn't feel it on an emotional level, but there is something to navigate there. And how did you, I know we have a lot of healthcare workers and people in the medical field in the room with us today. How did you navigate that? And can you talk a little bit about?
Absolutely. So everybody who knows what HIPAA is, it's privacy. Your medical records are your business, not mine. Certain things you can get away with if it's in the public sphere. If there's an accident on a corner, I can describe the accident. I can describe the people. The minute I start to render care, that goes away. Now I have to get permission. So for me writing this memoir, obviously I wasn't going to get permission from some of the regulars. I talk about the regular patients.
Right.
You know, it would be too hard and too unwieldy. So there's things you could do. You can change names. You can change characteristics somewhat. Some of the characters in my book, one of them we have a name called Classic Tile. He did it for me. He wears a shirt from a tile shop that says Classic Tile. He never gives us his name, so we just call him Classic Tile. So that's great. You can't identify him by his birth name. So that worked out well. But so you could change the names, you change ages sometimes, and sometimes you have to change dates and addresses because you can look up my unit histories. It's public record. So if I get too specific with an address, let's say I changed Seema's name, but I say she lived in 123 Main Street and I treated her on the 17th of March, somebody can look that up. So you have to sometimes shift a few details so that you protect HIPAA. But there are some people you want to give them their credit, their due, especially in the opening, in the prologue for me, I talk about a man who had a big impact on my life, a fellow lieutenant, who I wound up treating in cardiac arrest. So what I had to do, which was very scary, was go meet his family, who I knew his family, but they didn't know I was writing about him. They didn't know I was going to write about his death, and all the intimate details of when I walked in, he said, "Anthony, thank God you're here." One of his last phrases, and I questioned, well, where is God at this moment? These things, these moments you have internally, and you're going to write about them. And so what I had to do was set up a meeting with his family and let them read what I wrote. Unfinished. I finished that portion, but what if they say no? What if they say, we don't want you to write about him? That changes the whole structure of the book. So some of this is a leap of faith, and you have to realize that you're honoring somebody and memorializing them, and that the family is going to want them to be remembered that way. So if you need a specific person to be real in a memoir, especially a medical one, then that's going to change some of your writing because you're going to have to get the family to approve it. Same thing goes for your own family when you write about them. I'm fortunate, it's not the right word. When I talk about my brother and my parents, when I sat down with the lawyers for the book company, they go, "Hey, we need their permission to write about these things because you write about some crazy stuff." And I go, "Well, they were all passed away. So I'm next of kin, I give permission." That was easy. But everybody else, you're going to have to, work it out.
Yeah.
Was there anything else in there I might have missed something?
No, I think that was a really great answer, and it gives a lot to think about, because you have a responsibility, right? When you are wielding the pen, to think about people who don't have that privilege or don't have that. And it sounds like you did think about that a lot.
It weighs on you. It weighs on you.
Can you, before we get into following your lead on some writing, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about about your courage? You have a lot. I know. Just this is a hard one, but you have this courage. You have these two kinds of courage that I would love to hear about. One is the courage to make friends. That's really like, I think, an underestimated thing, is that you reach out and you ask people about themselves and you make these connections. And it is really, it's brave because there's this chance of rejection and you do it. And then the other kind of courage that you have is that you don't look away from the dark. In your own writing, in your own self, you look at it and you name it. And part of how we survive courage is caring for ourselves. So if you could just talk about how you see those things, how you live this way.
Well, I mean, when you grow up in the situations I described in the book, very traumatic, very visceral, physically and emotionally and mentally, where it's easy to develop trust issues. The first thing that goes when you grow up in a traumatic childhood is your self-esteem. Right? That's out the window. You don't know how to balance those things. And so what happened with me is, instead of sitting home at the house, it forces me out. I talk about in the book how I went to a Yankee game the day my brother died, and I took the money that my brother had given me, which was procured by selling drugs and stealing and stuff. And I took the friends across the street. We went to the Yankee game. I paid for their tickets. I wanted to find a sense of community, even if it's more dysfunction, but it's other people's dysfunction. So I find community in, oh, your mother beat you too, or
It's real, yeah.
And some of the joys too. It's not always traumatic, oh, your dad takes you to the movies. My dad takes me to the movies. So, okay, that's normal. You start to part and parcel what seems okay. And then you realize, oh, I'm not alone in these other things, right? And what that made me do was start to ask questions of people. And you're not always going to get a good response. I've been yelled at by people I've known. I've been told anybody who pays for sex is pathetic. When I was talking about it in a way of, I'm doing this as a way of trying to find some type of peace and chaos and comfort, and I was really exposing, and the person I was exposing to really wasn't ready for that. And so you're going to learn the hard way. Certain people can hear you, and certain people, because you're going to touch a nerve that triggers them, is going to reject you right away. And it's going to hurt you.
Yeah.
And the courage there is to keep going. Find somebody else, right? Because in a memoir, in fiction, in anything you write, there's always going to be a piece of you in that. And you're going to have to figure out what that you is. So you have to have a sense of self, is my first rule. And my second rule is you have to have a sense of community. You're not the only one that goes through it. So you have to find somebody to bounce it off of. When you tell your stories in a memoir, I wrote that down as one of the things. Tell your friends the stories. Tell people you trust the stories. How does this sound to you? Because in your head, it's going to sound great. It's going to sound, oh, I did all these things. And your friend's going to be going, I couldn't have been more bored. Or I couldn't. Listen, Anthony, when you tell the story, what happened? And they'll start to ask some questions to clarify things. And that helps you hone the story. It's easy for me because my positions in life and the things I grew up with forced me to speak. So I think I can orate well. Not everybody has that. And it's important to go with people who you will take time and patience while you speak to them and struggle through speaking through these things and give you feedback you need. So that courage comes from the stuff I was born in and wanting to find people and find a sense of community. And I'm very fortunate. I have what I call a group home, right? The group home is symbolic. When you're in a group home, you've kind of been left behind somehow. The actual group home, we're all left behind. Physically, emotionally, we're all kind of these broken people who found each other and we apply each other's duct tape. Come here, Mike. Your duct tape fell off. Let me get you, There, you're good. Go out and have a nice day. The other courage, which was, Seema, remind me again, I'm sorry.
Face the dark, to
Yes.
face this stuff. And maybe you partially answered it in the community question. But there's so much other stuff you could be doing, right? Like at any moment, there's 100 channels of television and all of the Netflix, but you choose to face the dark in this hard way.
So I had somebody tell me once that when you're going through it, I think it's a Winston Churchill quote, but he kind of made it his own. Sometimes when you're going through hell, just keep going. But you got to sit there for a little bit to make sure you're going the right way.
Mm.
So when you're in those dark places, especially when writing, it's going to trigger you. You're writing about things in the past, or you're writing about current things, and you're going to feel sad. Keep writing. Keep writing, even if it's gibberish. Even if while you're trying to process the thought, you're writing, the weather today is 80 degrees. Just keep moving the pen if you can. Obviously, there's moments, especially for me writing this, where I had my own suicidal ideations, which I express in our poetry, in the poetry groups, where I struggled with, I had an attempt where I sat, I don't want to give away the whole book, but where I talk about my going through the motions of actually saying, you know what, it's done, I'm done, And it's hard. You don't want to write that. You want to feel like you're the hero of the story. But there are many different types of heroes. Not all of them are that Superman back to me. Mm-hmm. And if you think about his story, it's complicated, right? It's all complicated. So when you write in those dark moments, you want to make sure that in a memoir, especially a memoir that can be something where you're talking about an entity such as the fire department or the city of New York, you can't just keep bashing them or going after and not turning inward, right? Because then also I'm putting myself up here in this situation when I'm struggling, right? You want the reader to empathize and sympathize with you and maybe the person you're going after or the person you're writing about. Mm. Hey, it's a crazy situation. Maybe Anthony's writing it and telling us that we didn't all know what we were doing, or my mom or my brother, whoever you're writing about. So this is something I mentioned to Seema earlier. Not everybody gets a halo, including yourself, right? There's no angels here. We have angelic moments that we can sit there and really look at each other and go, that's something powerful. I can see the light there. But, you get tired flying all the time. So you got to come back down to earth and you got to really work through that process and write. And don't be afraid. It's easy to say I shouldn't say it. It's easy to say don't be afraid because I just did it. But I promise that if you really try and expose the deepest, darkest stuff, even if it doesn't make whatever you're writing or published, you'll feel better for it, I think. I feel that just getting it on paper and reading it helps you analyze it.
Yeah. You feel worse for a moment. And that's that tricky moment where you're in hell and then you keep going and then you feel some sense of knowledge about it.